إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهديه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So carrying on then with Kitab al-Siyam from Buloogh al-Maraam, the chapter of fasting, we begin today with the Hadith of Ibn ʿAbbās radiyallahu anhuma, where he mentioned أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم احتجم وهو محرم واحتجم وهو صائم. The hadith which is in Al-Bukhārī, where Ibn Abbas mentions that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had cupping done to him when he was in the state of Iḥrām, meaning he was doing his ʿUmrah or his Ḥajj in the state of Iḥrām, and he had cupping done. Then the second sentence of that same hadith says وَاحْتَجَمَ وَهُوَ صَائِمٌ, and that he also had the cupping done on another occasion when he was fasting. So this topic we're going to discuss now is going to be the issue of cupping when you are fasting. Is it permissible to get the cupping done when you are fasting or not? This first hadith, and we have three to look at altogether. This first one in Bukhārī, hadith of Ibn Abbas, seems to suggest that cupping is permissible when you're fasting, because this hadith says احتجم وهو محرم واحتجم وهو صائم. Hadith in Bukhārī, where the first part of it says the messenger had the cupping done when he was in Iḥrām, and the second part of it says, and he had cupping done when he was fasting. So this first hadith seems to suggest that cupping is allowed when you are fasting, because it says that the messenger had the cupping done when he was fasting, and the hadith is in Al-Bukhārī. But then we have another hadith, the next one that Al-Hāfidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala mentions here, the hadith of Shaddād ibn Aws radiyallahu anhu. In this one he mentions أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أتى على رجل بالبقيع وهو يحتجم في رمضان. In this hadith, the second one now, the hadith of Shaddād ibn Aws radiyallahu anhu, it mentions that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam came across a man next to Baqī', which is right next to Al-Masjid al-Nabawi, that the messenger was walking by and he came across a man just there next to Baqī'. And this man was getting cupping done to him. And this was during the day in Ramadan when this incident occurred. This was in Ramadan during the daytime when the messenger was walking past and he saw this man getting cupped. So the messenger said to the man, أَفْطَرَ الْحَاجِمُ وَالْمَحْجُومُ. He said, the one who is doing the cupping on you, the one who is performing the cupping, and the one who is getting cupped, both of you, your fasts are broken. That's what this second hadith says. When the messenger saw the man during the day in Ramadan getting cupped, he said to him, the one performing the cupping and the one getting cupped, both of you, your fasts are broken. So this hadith, the second one here now, it seems to indicate that cupping is impermissible when you are fasting. Very clearly seems to indicate that cupping is impermissible when you are fasting. But then we have a third hadith also that Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentions here, and that is the hadith of Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu, where he says, أول ما كرهت الحجامة للصائم أن جعفر ibn Abū Ṭālib احتجم وهو صائم. In this hadith, and pay attention to this now, in this hadith, Anas ibn Malik says, initially at the beginning, originally, cupping whilst you are fasting was not allowed, and that is evidenced, he says, by the incident when Jaʿfar ibn Abū Ṭālib was getting cupped during Ramadan, during the day, and the messenger had said to him that you and the one cupping you, both of your fasts are broken. So in this hadith, to start with, Anas references the second hadith we mentioned. He says originally cupping was not allowed, and there is the incident of Jaʿfar ibn Abū Ṭālib when he was getting cupped and the messenger said, you and the one cupping you, both of your fasts are gone, both of you are broken your fasts. But then Anas highlights something extra. He then says, ثم رخص النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بعد في الحجامة للصائم. That afterwards the ruling was abrogated and the messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam then allowed for the cupping to be done when you are fasting. And the narration even highlights وَكَانَ أَنَسُ يَحْتَجِمُ وَهُوَ صَائِمٌ. That Anas radiyallahu anhu himself used to get the cupping done when he was fasting. So we have three narrations here. The first one in Bukhārī, where it said at the beginning of the hadith, the messenger had cupping done when he was in Iḥrām. Then the second part of the hadith says, and the messenger had cupping done when he was fasting. So that first hadith in Bukhārī indicates it's permissible. But the second hadith of Shaddād ibn Aws, when the messenger saw the two men, one of them cupping the other one in Ramadan during the day, he said to them, أَفْطَرَ الْحَاجِمُ وَالْمَحْجُومُ. Both of you, your fasts are broken. Because in the olden days, cupping was not done with the suction cups that we have these days. In the olden days, they would have to put some type of device onto the person, and then somebody else would have to use a straw to create the suction. In the olden days, that's how they would do it. They would use some type of straw onto that cup to create the suction to suck the blood out. And so it used to be the case that there was a possibility that the one who was performing the cupping may end up accidentally with some of that blood coming into his mouth from the suction he is trying to create with the straw onto the cup. That's the way they used to do it in the olden days. So the messenger said, both of your fasts are broken. So that hadith indicates it's impermissible. But then there was the third hadith, which apparently combined between the first two and said, yes, originally cupping was not allowed. And the messenger had said to the two of them, your fasts are broken. But then afterwards it was abrogated, and the messenger allowed for the cupping to be done when you are fasting. So what is the conclusion on this issue? The scholars do have a difference of opinion on the issue of cupping. The jumhur of the scholars, the majority of the scholars, their opinion is that cupping does not break your fast. And that is the Al-Imam Abu Hanifa, Al-Imam Malik, Al-Imam Shafi'i. They are all of the opinion that cupping does not break your fast. And the evidences they will use are obvious. They will say, look, there's a hadith in Bukhārī where it mentioned the messenger getting cupped when he was in Iḥrām, but also in the second part of the hadith it said he got cupped when he was fasting. They will use that as an evidence, obviously. And they will use the third narration, the hadith of Anas, as an evidence, obviously. They will say, look, Anas radiyallahu anhu is highlighting to you that the narration about cupping, breaking your fast, was abrogated, so it's allowed now. And Anas himself used to get cupped when he was fasting. Hence, the majority of the scholars have the opinion it is permissible and it does not break your fast. However, there is another opinion, the second opinion, which is the opinion of Al-Imam Ahmad and the opinion of Ishaq ibn Rahoya, the Shaykh of Al-Imam al-Bukhārī, the opinion of Ibn Khuzaymah, the choice of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah and his student Ibn al-Qayyim. Their opinion is that cupping breaks your fast. What is the obvious evidence they are going to use? The second hadith that we mentioned, hadith of Shaddād ibn Aws, where the messenger saw the two men, one of them cupping the other one during the day in Ramadan, and he said, Aftar al-hājim wal-mahjūm. Both of you, your fasts are broken. That is the obvious narration they will use. But they will somehow need to explain the hadith in Bukhārī, where it mentioned that the messenger got cupping done when he was fasting. And if you look into the details, then they do explain that hadith. And they say that the hadith in its origin is authentic. Of course, it is in Al-Bukhārī. The origin of the hadith is authentic. It's in Al-Bukhārī. But they say, look at it very carefully. They say, look at the hadith very carefully, because that hadith in Bukhārī is made up of two parts. The first and original part of the hadith says the messenger got the cupping done when he was in Iḥrām. They say that's absolutely authentic. But then the second part of the hadith, and he got the cupping done when he was fasting, they say that part of the hadith is not actually a part of the original hadith of Al-Bukhārī. And that some of the narrators made a mistake by adding on that second sentence onto the hadith. And if you look into the sciences of hadith, then it is something quite valid. They are able to prove to a reasonable amount of evidence that the second part of the narration is an add-on, an addition by accident by one of the narrators. So they say the reality of the matter is that the hadith in Bukhārī only says the messenger got the cupping done when he was in Iḥrām, authentic. But the second part of it, they say that's not even part of the hadith. That's a mistake that was added on. And he got the cupping done when he was fasting. That second sentence, they say, no, that isn't part of the hadith of Bukhārī. That's a mistake. It should not be in Bukhārī. That is a mistake from the narrators. They added on that second sentence. So they do not accept that second sentence from the hadith of Bukhārī. They say that's a mistake. It's not supposed to be part of that hadith. The original part is the authentic hadith of Bukhārī, they say. So in that way, they are able to explain why they are not taking that part of the narration. And when you look into the sciences of hadith and the details, there is a reasonable argument they have to say that the second part is not part of the original hadith. But even if they've explained that, they still need to explain the hadith of Anas ibn Malik, because Anas ibn Malik said, your narration about the messenger telling them both of your fasts are broken is abrogated. How do they explain that? Again, it comes down to the sciences of hadith, but in a very, very simplified manner. What they say is that the hadith of Shaddād ibn Aws, where the messenger saw the two men and said, both of your fasts are broken, that is actually a very strong hadith in terms of the chains of narration, and the level it is at in terms of its strength is quite good. Whereas the hadith of Anas ibn Malik, when he said it's abrogated, that hadith is actually lower down in its strength. The hadith of Anas, just to make it very simple, is here, and the hadith of Shaddād ibn Aws is here. It's a stronger hadith in terms of the chains of narration, etc. So they say, the likes of Imam Ahmad and Ishaq ibn Rahoya and Ibn Khuzaymah and Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim, they say, look, we are not going to accept abrogation like this. You cannot use a hadith which is here and try and come up and abrogate our hadith which is above you. They say, no, abrogation doesn't work like that. Bring us a narration which is of equal strength that can then overwhelm this narration and abrogate it, fair enough. But as for bringing a narration that is weaker in its level of strength compared to our narration, you cannot bring that one up and abrogate our narration. They say the sciences of hadith doesn't work like that. You cannot use a narration which is not as strong as ours and lift it up and abrogate ours with it. No. So they do not accept abrogation like that. And it's a very valid and fair point again within the sciences of hadith. So in that way, if they don't accept this abrogation, and they have mentioned and clarified that the second part of the hadith of Bukhārī isn't part of the original hadith, just a mistake, it was added on, then that means their opinion ends up being the correct opinion. That the messenger told them, both of you, your fasts are broken. And this is, you can see in a nutshell, that is a very summarized and brief explanation of the issue. In the books of fiqh, you will find much, much more detail, but you have an overview of the issue and the different ahadith and why there are differences between the scholars on this topic of whether cupping breaks your fast or not. But in a nutshell, as you can see there, the Jumhur, Al-Imam Abu Hanifa, Al-Imam Malik, Al-Imam Shafi'i, they have the opinion it doesn't break your fast. And the likes of Al-Imam Ahmad and Ishaq ibn Rahoya, Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim, they have the opinion that it does. And you've seen there in a very brief manner why those differences exist between them. So that is in relation to cupping, and that there is a clear difference of opinion that exists on that issue. Then the next hadith, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala mentions here, عن عائشة رضي الله عنها أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اقتحل في رمضان وهو صائم. This narration that Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar mentions in Buloogh al-Maraam, he actually mentions it himself that it is a weak narration. This narration that says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used the kuhl, the black eyelining, the kuhl whilst he was fasting. The narration is weak. However, in terms of the fiqh, then as the scholars have said, If a person used kuhl, the black lining around the eyes, when you are fasting, then it cannot be said that this breaks your fast, because that does not have any nutritional value for the body. And so if a person did use that, it wouldn't break your fast. And as Shaykh al-Fawzan mentions certain other types of medications that have similar rulings. He says, for example, eye drops. Eye drops technically do not break your fast because there is no nutritional value by putting liquid into your eyes. Yet, however, the scholars do say you should avoid it if you can. For example, if the doctor says to you, you just need to use these drops once in the day, then you have no need to use it when you're fasting. Use it in the evening, or even twice a day. You could manage once at Maghrib, once at Fajr, before the time of fasting. So if you are able to avoid eye drops during fasting, you should do so. Avoid them. If you cannot, you have to take it every 4 hours or something, then you will have to take a dose or 2 doses during the day when you're fasting. It is permissible. It doesn't break your fast. But the reason why the scholars say you should try to avoid it is because, as Shaykh al-Fawzan mentions, it is known that when you put drops into your eyes, there are people who have mentioned you sometimes experience a tingling feeling in your throat, a change of taste in your throat from that liquid going into your eyes. And so as Shaykh al-Fawzan says, from being cautious of this affair, you should avoid using the eye drops. But if you cannot avoid it, then it's permissible and it doesn't break your fast. Similarly, eardrops, same ruling. If you can avoid using them whilst you are fasting, then that is better, as Shaykh al-Fawzan says. Because of the same reason, eardrops are not of nutritional value, but sometimes when you place eardrops in there, you may experience a tingling in the throat, you may experience a sensation in the throat or a change of taste in the throat. So again, from caution, as Shaykh al-Fawzan says, it is better to avoid using eardrops when you're fasting, if possible. If you cannot and you must take the doses during the day, then again, that technically does not break your fast. As for nose drops, then they break your fast. Nose drops, they break your fast because the Shaykh says the nose is a direct inlet into the stomach, into the digestive system. Direct inlet, directly connected. And so taking nose drops would be from the things that break your fast. As for the asthma inhalers, for example, many of the scholars have the fatwa that asthma inhalers do not break your fast, even though they are being taken direct inlet through your mouth. But that's because they say the asthma inhaler, it is basically a light air powder with no nutritional value in it. It goes into your lungs, and even if some of it did not go into the lungs and went the other way, there is no nutritional value in that. It is basically a very light, airy content, little bit of powder with no nutritional value in that. So it would not break your fast to take asthma inhalers. As for injections, then again the scholars, they highlight the principle regarding nutritional value. If an injection or a vaccine, whatever type that may be that you have to have injected, some medicine, some vaccine, whatever it might be, then it does not break your fast unless there is some nutritional value in that medicine, in that vaccine, in that injection. If there is some nutritional value in it to your body, then it breaks your fast. But if that injection or vaccine or whatever it is has no nutritional value for your body, then it does not break your fast. Because the point is inserting nutrition into your body, food, drink, and anything which is equivalent to them. So if this injection has the makeup of it, which gives you the equivalent of food and drink, of nutrition to your body, then it breaks your fast. But if it does not at all, then it does not break your fast according to the principles as the scholars have mentioned. As for injections to extract blood, then they do not break your fast. An extraction of a small amount of blood does not break your fast. If you have to give a sample, they need to extract that from your body. That does not break your fast. And so these are some of the rulings in regards to those affairs. Then the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من نسي وهو صائم فأكل أو شرب فليتم صومه فإنما أطعمه الله وسقاه. Hadith in Al-Bukhārī and Muslim. And the hadith of Al-Hakim, من أفطر في رمضان ناسيا فلا قضاء عليه ولا كفارة. This is now about the topic of eating something when you're fasting accidentally, forgetfully. And the narration says, whomsoever forgets that he is fasting, forgets whilst he is fasting, and he eats or he drinks something, then let him continue his fast thereafter. When he remembers, continue the fast for the rest of the day. For indeed, that is Allah who has fed him and given him that drink. This narration therefore highlights the principle that is mentioned in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا إِن نَسِينَا أَوْ أَخْطَأْنَا. Our Lord, do not hold us accountable if we forget or we make a mistake. So this hadith is now telling us, if you make a mistake, you forget, and you end up eating or drinking, it doesn't break your fast. If you genuinely forgot and ate something, genuinely forgot your fasting and ended up drinking something, then you remember, then the food and the drink that you've had does not impact upon your fast. That is rizq that Allah has given you, and you continue the rest of your fast, and it counts and it is valid. However, the scholars have mentioned, Shaykh al-Uthaymeen rahimahullah and others, that when this happens, imagine now you completely forget and you start eating something. Then you remember. As soon as you remember, you must stop immediately. Even if you had a bite in your mouth and then you remembered, that bite, you must take it out of your mouth. Do not swallow it. If you remember, and then the bite which you have in your mouth, you allow it to be swallowed, your fast has now broken, because now you have eaten it after you remember. So as soon as you remember, even if the food is already in your mouth, you're in the middle of eating, and you remember that food in your mouth, you must get it out, wash it out. You cannot swallow that now. And then the rest of the day carries on and counts, and you are not held accountable upon the forgetfulness and upon the mistake that you made in eating without remembering that you are fasting. And there is no day that you have to make up for that. That day counts. It counts. You don't have to make it up again afterwards, as long as you stopped immediately when you remember. And if you finished your meal and then after the meal you remembered, khalas, same ruling. That meal, you've had it now, Allah blessed you with it. The rest of the day you continue your fast and it counts, and you don't have to make that day up. Then we have the narration of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من ذرعه القيء فلا قضاء عليه ومن استقاء فعليه القضاء. This is about the issue of vomiting. The narration says, whomsoever is overcome by vomit, meaning you're feeling sick and you can't stop yourself, you end up vomiting. Whoever is overwhelmed, overcome by vomiting, then that doesn't affect your fast. You don't have to make up that day, carry on. But whomsoever makes himself vomit, then upon that person is to make up that day. The one who is overcome by vomit, then that is not of your choice. If you're feeling sick, you have some problem in your stomach, etc., you can't stop yourself, you vomit, then that is not of your choice what you did, and so that is not something held accountable upon you, and you do not break your fast in that way. If you are not feeling well and you end up vomiting, your fast counts still. But sometimes a person, when he's fasting, he's not feeling well and he wants to vomit, because normally when you vomit, then after that you feel a bit better. So maybe sometimes a person is not feeling too good and he wants to make himself vomit, and so he uses whatever method, either physically by putting his finger and prodding in his mouth to try and make himself vomit, or it doesn't just have to be physically. Maybe he goes and smells something disgusting to himself, which makes him vomit. Maybe he goes to the garbage, to the trash can, opens it up and smells that. And as a consequence of smelling that bad smell, he ends up vomiting. That comes under the ruling of having made yourself vomit. Likewise, if a person looks at something disgusting that makes him vomit, for example, anything disgusting, it could be that there is a dead animal outside, there's a dead rat outside. You see a dead mouse or a dead rat, which a cat has eaten half of it, and the intestines are falling out of it. A disgusting sight to be seen. Maybe a person goes and looks at that on purpose, and looking at this disgusting sight makes him vomit. He would be under the ruling of having made himself vomit. So do not think having made yourself vomit is just physically with your finger or something. You may smell something on purpose or look at something on purpose, which causes you to then vomit as a consequence, then that would be considered as vomiting on purpose. So the one who makes himself vomit on purpose, then his fast is broken. But if you're genuinely not feeling well and you can't help it, you end up vomiting, then that doesn't affect your fast. Then after that we come to the narration of Jaʿfar ibn Abdullah radiyallahu anhuma. أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم خرج عام الفتح إلى مكة في رمضان فصام حتى بلغ كراع الغميم فصام الناس ثم دعا بقدح من ماء فرفعه حتى نظر الناس إليه ثم شرب فقيل له بعد ذلك إن بعض الناس قد صام فقال أولئك العصاة وفي لفظ فقيل له إن بعض الناس قد شق عليهم الصيام وإنما ينتظرون فيما فعلت فدعا بقدح من ماء بعد العصر فشربه رواه Muslim. This hadith now tells us about the topic of traveling and fasting. What are the rulings on fasting when a person is traveling? In this narration, it tells us, Jaʿfar ibn Abdullah radiyallahu anhuma says that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam exited from Medina in the year when the conquering of Mecca occurred. That's the 8th year of Hijrah. And we know from the Seerah that the believers, they headed out from Medina during Ramadan. When they went to Mecca and conquered Mecca, they left Medina during Ramadan. So this is the story of that. He says we exited in Ramadan from Medina heading towards Mecca for when the conquering of Mecca occurred. So he said they headed out from Medina until they arrived at a place known as Qura' al-Ghamim. that is a distance out of Mecca. When they were heading out towards Medina, they arrived at this location, Qura' al-Ghamim. And the people were fasting because, like we said, this was in Ramadan when they headed out towards Mecca to conquer Mecca. So everybody was fasting that day when they headed out on their journey towards Mecca. But when they got to this place, Qura' al-Ghamim, they stopped there and the messenger requested a vessel, like a type of vessel or bowl, and it had water in it. And he raised that up in front of all of the people until everybody was looking at him, and then he drank from it. Raised up that vessel and then drank from it in front of everyone. And this was during the day, that day when they had headed out towards Mecca. So when the people, they saw that, some of them came to the messenger and said to him, some people are still fasting. The messenger said, they are sinners. They are sinners. In the other version, it mentions that they came to the messenger that day and they said that the fasting has become a great difficulty upon some people. And that's when the messenger got the vessel of water and drank it in front of all of them to show them what? To show them we are traveling and you don't have to be fasting. In fact, not only that, when they came and told him, but some people, even after seeing you drink it, so they've seen that you're not fasting, they've carried on fasting and they haven't opened their fasts. The messenger said, they are sinners, they are sinners. This narration therefore seems to indicate that you should not fast when you are traveling. That's what it seems to indicate. Because when they headed out from Medina that day, and they were journeying towards Mecca to conquer Mecca. As they were journeying out on that first day, obviously that journey would take quite some days. On the first day, as they headed out, they were all fasting because it was Ramadan. And when it got to Asr time, they'd been traveling all day in the desert, in the heat. Some of the people, they came to the messenger and said, it's a great burden upon some of the people to be fasting. So then the messenger requested the water until they all looked at him and he drank it to show them, you don't need to be fasting. We are traveling. You do not need to be fasting. We are traveling. And yet when some of them came and said that there are amongst us a few who have refused to open their fast, they are still fasting. The messenger said they are sinners then, which seems to indicate you should not fast when you are traveling. Because when they came and told him, some people have continued still, even though they've seen you, etc., and they know you don't have to be fasting, they've carried on fasting. The messenger said they are sinners then. So the hadith seems to suggest that you should not fast when you are traveling, and in fact, it is wrong for you to fast when you are traveling. That's what this first hadith seems to suggest. But then, we have another hadith which goes along with this one, and that is the hadith of Hamza ibn Amr al-Aslami radiyallahu anhu. أنه قال يا رسول الله أجد بي قوة على الصيام في السفر فهل علي جناح. Hamza ibn Amr al-Aslami radiyallahu anhu, he came to the messenger and said to him that, O messenger, I find in myself strength. That he was a strong, healthy man. He said, I find within myself strength to be able to fast even when I'm traveling. I have the strength to do it. So is there any issue upon me for doing that? Is there any wrong or any problem in me doing so? I have the strength in me. I have the ability. I have the health. I can fast even when I'm traveling and journeying. So is there any problem in me doing so, in fasting when I'm traveling? The messenger said to him, فَقَالَ لَهُ Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, هي رخصة من الله فمن أخذ بها فحسن. The first thing the messenger said to him was, it is a permission Allah has given. It is an ease Allah has facilitated for you, that when you are traveling, you don't need to fast. It is an ease, a comfort that Allah has facilitated for you. So whomsoever takes that rukhsah, that ease and facilitation that Allah has provided you, then that's good. It is good, the one who takes that ease that Allah has provided you, that you don't need to fast when you're traveling. The messenger told him that it's an ease, a facilitation Allah's given you. And whoever takes that and therefore doesn't fast when they are traveling, then that's good. However, man ahabba an yasuma fala junaha alayh. But however, if someone did want to fast when they are traveling, then there is no problem upon them. There is no issue upon them. So now then, this hadith is in Muslim. This hadith seems to indicate that yes, when you are traveling, you have the permission and the license given to you from Allah to miss the fasting when you are traveling. Because when Hamza ibn Amr al-Aslami radiyallahu anhu came to ask the messenger that I am strong, I can fast even when I'm traveling, so is there any problem? The messenger said it's a permission Allah's given you in terms of not having to fast when you travel. So if you take that permission of Allah and don't fast when you're traveling, that's the good thing. But if you wish to fast whilst you are traveling, then there's no problem upon you. This narration therefore indicates you have a choice. Whereas the first narration, when some people came to him and said, but there are amongst us some of us who have carried on fasting, the messenger said they are sinners. Whereas in this one, the messenger did not tell him you would be a sinner for doing that. He said, if you want, then yes, it's okay. So how do we combine between the two narrations? The scholars, in a nutshell, once again, summarized. They say that it all depends on the ability of a person. If a person has ability, strength, health, and he's able to fast when he's traveling, then he can. Because that will mean you don't have any days left to make up afterwards. Imagine if you're traveling in Ramadan and you decide to fast, then you won't have any days left to make up afterwards. And that's a good thing, the scholars, they say. It's better that you do the worship then, rather than having that worship as a responsibility and burden upon your shoulder, like a debt that you have to cover later. If you've got the strength to do it now, then just do it when you're traveling and fast. Because the messenger allowed Hamza radiallahu anhu to do that. But other scholars, they say, no, you should take the permission and not fast, because the messenger did tell him that that this is a permission Allah has given, and you should take that permission. In the other narration, it mentions, Inna Allah yuhibbu an tu'ta rukhasu. Allah loves that you take the permissions He gives you. The ease that Allah facilitates for you, you should take it. So some scholars have the opinion you shouldn't fast when you're traveling, even if you're capable. But others, they say, no, it's good, fast if you're capable, because then you don't have a debt upon your shoulders to make up those days later. But ultimately, it all comes down to the ability. If you have the ability, then you have the choice. If you do not have the ability to fast when you are traveling, you don't have the strength or the health, then you fall into the first narration. If you try fasting when you are traveling and you're incapable, then you fall into the narration when the messenger said they are sinning. Why did the messenger tell them that they are sinning? Because that was a difficult journey. Imagine 200 miles, 250 miles from Mecca to Medina, whatever the exact distance is, in the heat and the deserts of those days, no cars or vehicles with AC, in the heat and the desert of traveling, in the sun, difficult. So it was not befitting for anybody to claim that they've got strength to fast in those conditions. Rather, it was upon them not to fast in those conditions. And so when some of them tried, the messenger said they are sinning. Because a person who is not in a position of ability, the situation and the conditions do not allow you to do so, then you shouldn't fast when you're traveling. But when the affair has ease in it, like these days now with cars and AC and whatever else, and a person has the ability and the health, then the narration of Hamza radiallahu anhu applies that you have a choice. If you decide, I would rather just do them now, therefore not have the burden of responsibility of this debt to make up those days afterwards, better I do my worship now. Allahu a'lam, if I'll be alive later, then good, do the fasting now when you're traveling if you have the ability. But other scholars still say, even if you are capable, don't do it, because of the narration, Inna Allah yuhibbu an tubtaru khasru, that Allah loves that you take the permissions He gives you. Allah loves that you take the license and the ease and the permissions that He gives you. The final narration we'll have a quick look at before concluding today then is the hadith of Ibn ʿAbbās radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma قال رخص للشيخ الكبير أن يفطر ويطعم عن كل يوم مسكينا ولا قضاء عليه. This is now talking about certain other types of people who are excused from fasting. We've just mentioned one type of people now who are excused from fasting, the travelers. That's one category of people who are excused from fasting, the one who is traveling, as long as it is a journey of righteousness and not a journey of haram, as some scholars have mentioned. The second category of people who are permitted to miss fasting is what this narration says, that the ease and the license and the permission has been given to the elderly to miss the fasting, meaning the elderly who are no longer capable of fasting. But if somebody was elderly but fit and healthy and they can still fast, then they have to fast. But this is talking about the elderly who are now weak and they have maybe illnesses and other things and they can't fast anymore. Then the religion allows them ease that they don't have to fast then. They are too old, they are too weak, they have illnesses, etc. They cannot fast with that old age and that weakness they are upon now. Then they are allowed to miss the fasting. But what do they have to do? أن يطعم عن كل يوم مسكينا. They have to give the fidya to feed a poor person for every day. So those 29 days or 30 days that they are not going to fast now because they are old in age and can no longer burden the fasting, then they would simply have to feed a poor person for every day that they miss. So that will be 29 or 30 days if it is the full month that they live through. And they do not have to make anything up, obviously. The elderly person who misses due to his weakness, then he's not going to get any younger and get stronger. He will only get more weaker afterwards. So there is nothing to make up. It is simply to give fidya for every day that he misses. Here you should therefore also recognize something, that somebody who is elderly in age is allowed to miss because of their weakness. As for somebody elderly in age who's fit and healthy, they fast. But the one who is weak and unable, they miss and they feed a poor person for every day. What about somebody who is sick? What is the ruling for the one who is sick? This depends on the type of sickness. Basically, two types of sickness. One is a sickness that is temporary. The other is a sickness that is constant. As for a person who has a temporary sickness, like somebody gets a fever for a few days, they get a cold, a fever, some problem for a few days, and they have to miss a few days in the middle of Ramadan when they were sick. That's a temporary illness. Then they will recover. Once they have recovered, they will have to make up those days. A person who has a temporary illness where it is expected they will recover afterwards. A person is ill for a week or 2 weeks, even a month or 2 months. But the doctors, they say it's no problem, this medicine, that medicine, inshallah, you will recover. We see our patients recover. It may take a month, it may take 2 months. But if it is a disease or an illness where you are expected to recover from, so it's only a temporary sickness, then in that case, wait until you recover and make up the days that you missed. As for the other type, a person who has an illness that is constant, you have some type of illness which prevents you from fasting, and that is something that is with you now for the rest of your life. It is not expected that you will ever recover from that illness. You're going to be on certain medications and affairs of that nature for the rest of your life now for this particular illness you have. So you're never going to be able to fast for the rest of your life. It is an illness, la yurja bur'uhu, as they say in the books of fiqh. It is not expected for him to ever recover from that illness. It's a constant illness to the end of your days. So you're never going to be able to fast. So what do? Then you are like the elderly person in the ruling. You're allowed to miss the fasting, and you would simply feed a poor person for every day that you miss. Because we cannot say you have to make up the fasts. It's a constant illness you have. No recovery is expected. So you simply miss then if that illness is an illness that prevents you from fasting, because not every illness is a reason to miss the fasting. Only an illness that affects you. In the times of the Salaf, they used to say that the criteria should be, if you are well enough to get up out of your bed and your home and go to the shop and come back, you're not ill enough to miss the fasting. That's what some of them used to say. If you're well enough to get up and go to the shop to pick up some bread and milk and come home again, then that means you are not sick enough to miss fasting. But if you're sick that you cannot get up, you cannot get out of the home, then okay, you are sick enough now to miss the fasting. So it's not every illness you have to judge, is it an illness that is actually going to harm you or delay your recovery? Then yes, you're allowed to miss the fasting. But if it's a minor type of thing you've got, which isn't going to affect your recovery time, it's not going to harm you to even fast with that small illness, whatever it is, then you have to fast. So now in summary here we can say, a traveler is allowed to miss fasting and he has to make up the days afterwards if he chooses to miss them when he's traveling. A sick person is allowed to miss the fasting and he makes up the days afterwards if it was a temporary sickness, and he gives the fidya, feeds a poor person if it's a constant sickness. The elderly person is also allowed to miss the fasting and he simply feeds a poor person for every day that he misses. Those are 3 categories of people that are allowed to miss the fasting so far. There are others too, but so far we've now covered the traveler, the elderly person, and the sick person. That is where we'll conclude today then. And inshallah ta'ala, next week we'll discuss the next ahadith and narrations that follow in this chapter. Some of those in relation to intimacy and the rulings if somebody falls into intimacy. Some of those regarding the menstruation and the postnatal bleeding and the rulings for the women regarding that. Do they have to make up afterwards, or is it just fidya? And also in relation to somebody who dies and they had days left to make up from Ramadan, is the next of kin supposed to make them up on the behalf of that person? Or is that it gone because he's died? Those are some of the issues we'll have a look at from next week's lesson, inshallah ta'ala. And we'll have to conclude on that for today then. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.